Hello, friend. Welcome to my channel. Today, I am going to present you the amazing testimony of a first century man as absolute proof that there is life after death. The man is Saul of Tarsus, who later on became known as Paul. This man's claim was that Jesus Christ resurrected bodily from the dead, and that this event is an assurance to his followers that they too will be resurrected from the dead. I am going to present you with the evidence, and you will be the jurors. You will determine if the testimony meets the standard of proof beyond reasonable doubt. As any lawyer would do in court, first thing I will do is qualify my witness. I will present you with his exceptional life. Second, I will give you his testimony concerning the resurrection. Third, I will present you evidence that the record he left us is reliable. And then I will make my closing argument. I am confident that at the end of this presentation, you will have no doubt that there is life after death. Paul was born in Tarsus, a city located south of what is now Turkey. It was a center of learning and intellectualism. It even had a school that rivaled those of Alexandria and Athens. He was born a Roman citizen, a privilege that was not easy for a Jew to obtain. Either Paul's father or his grandfather must have been prominent members of that society. Perhaps they provided something of value to the Romans, which allowed them to become citizens. Scholars estimate that it was shortly after the age of 13 that the young Saul was sent to Jerusalem to learn under Gamaliel, who was considered the best teacher of the first century. At this age, you were considered ready to observe religious precepts. As a Jewish boy who was a member of high society, he was indoctrinated in the religion, and he was also taught a manual trade. It was all considered to be part of becoming a complete Jewish man. Paul grew up to be a Jewish scholar, a philosopher, a great intellectual of his generation. He also learned to be a tent maker. Unlike today, this was an indispensable and reputable profession. It was considered to be middle-class trade. In his letter to the Philippians, he gave an account of his status prior to becoming a Christian. He was from the tribe of Benjamin, considered to be one of the elite tribes among the Israelites. He was a Hebrew of Hebrews, circumcised the 8th day, meaning that his parents were pure Jews, strong adherents to the laws and rituals of Judaism. This was in contrast to many of the Jews in first century Palestine who were mixed with other races and cultures. He was a Pharisee, the strictest religious sect in Judaism at that time. He wrote to the Galatians and said that he advanced in this field far beyond many of his contemporaries. He was blameless as to the law. He had an impeccable reputation. Paul was a Jew among Jews with a great zeal for his faith, which turned him into a persecutor of this new sect that came out of Judaism called Christianity. Paul was an elite member of society, cream of the crop. As we might say in our society, he was living the dream. He was top echelon among his peers. However, he gave it all up to become what he hated most, a Christian. What happened to this man that led him to make such a drastic change in his life? This leads us to our second point, which is his testimony concerning the resurrection. Paul wrote 13 letters where he left a substantial record of his life and his testimony of the resurrection. These letters are known as epistles, and they are part of the canon of the New Testament. The letters were addressed to churches that existed at that time. They were written at different stages of his life. His testimony is corroborated by the book of Acts. The writer of this historical account is none other than Luke, the physician, who was a companion and partner in ministry of Paul. Luke wrote a detailed record of his conversion. Paul was on his way to Damascus after having obtained a certificate from the high priest, which granted him permission to arrest Christians and bring them back to Jerusalem for imprisonment. During this voyage, Jesus Christ, who had been crucified, appeared to him in spectacular fashion. This encounter left Paul blind for days until a man by the name of Ananias was sent to him by God to present the gospel, the good news of the resurrection. Paul was converted, and from this point onward, he becomes one of the most important voices in the first century proclaiming this message. What did Paul gain from this conversion? He was immediately rejected by his fellow Jews. They considered him a traitor, a blasphemer, worthy of death. He paid a great price for his conversion. He had to walk away from everything he had achieved to become a Christian. Christians were considered the lowest of the lowest in society at that time. They were just a minority, an insignificant new religion. They were a Galilean sect. Galileans were seen by other Jews as uneducated, unsophisticated. As a Christian, Paul was incarcerated often, where he was cold, hungry. He was beaten many times. He indicated that he bore in his body the sufferings of Christ. He was shipwrecked, persecuted, lived the life of a nomad, always traveling in treacherous roads and horrible conditions for the sake of advancing the faith. In the end, Paul was executed for his belief. Tradition says that he was decapitated. Why? What drove this man to make such a drastic change in his life? Why would he leave everything behind to pursue a Christian life? Throughout his epistles, you find that it was his belief that Jesus Christ was risen from the dead, and he promised his followers a future resurrection. In his letter to the Corinthians, Paul documents all the appearances of Jesus after resurrecting from the dead. He appeared to Peter, then he appeared to the 12 apostles, then he appeared to his brother James. Prior to that, experience was not among his followers. Overall, he appeared to over 500 folks, the majority of which were still alive when Paul wrote his epistle, within 25 years of the event. Lastly, he appeared to Paul. These people lived and died for this belief. Does it make sense if it was all for a lie? When you read the epistles of Paul, you find that he was a man with a tremendous zeal for righteousness. He was devoted to living a virtuous life. He had a love for truth, and he called upon his followers to live in the same way. Does it make sense if all his commitment to holiness, to honesty, to integrity was all based on a lie? The epistle to the Galatians is believed to have been written as early as AD 49, within 20 years of the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus Christ. In it, Paul says that after his conversion, he spent 3 years in Damascus and Arabia. After this time, Paul went to Jerusalem to meet with Peter and James, not the apostle, but the brother of Jesus. Bible scholar and Christian apologist Gary Habermas, who specializes in the historicity of the resurrection, points out that Paul's conversion took place within 2 to 3 years of Jesus' resurrection. This means that less than 5 years elapsed between Paul's conversion and his visit to Jerusalem. According to Habermas, even New Testament scholar Bart Ehrman admits this fact. He, by the way, is an atheist and not a friend of Orthodox Christianity. So this time frame is widely accepted in the field of scholarship. Why is this important? Because it establishes that we have a record of witnesses dating very close in time to the resurrection. We have Paul meeting with Peter, a man who was with Jesus from the beginning of his ministry until the end. And with James, the brother of Jesus Christ, who was with Jesus from childhood all the way to the end of his life. He met with these two pillars of the faith within 5 years of the event, and he spent 15 days getting an account of Jesus' life and his resurrection. Peter, by the way, wrote his own epistle where he corroborates Paul's testimony by affirming the resurrection of Jesus Christ. We have a multiplicity of sources that come together and support the testimony of Paul. Let me give you a few examples. The Gospel of Luke presents a historical narrative of the resurrection of Jesus Christ and his multiple apparitions to the disciples. The book of Acts is Luke's sequel to his Gospel. Acts had to be written less than 40 years before the crucifixion because it ends with Paul's incarceration in Rome. We know through historical sources that Paul was executed by Nero around the year 65 AD. If Acts, being the sequel, was written around the year 65 AD, then the Gospel of Luke was written earlier. Luke said that he wrote his Gospel after interviewing witnesses of the events. Undoubtedly, Paul was one of the witnesses since he was a close companion and one who had received direct evidence handed to him by Peter and James. One of the earliest records of the resurrection of Jesus is the Gospel of Mark. He was a disciple of Peter and a companion of Paul. Mark is believed to be the first gospel written. So that may place the Gospel of Mark somewhere in the 50s of the first century. Soon afterwards, the Gospel of Matthew was written. Both of these accounts have an account of resurrection appearances. Perhaps the earliest record of the resurrection are Paul's epistles to the Galatians and to the Thessalonians. Estimates of their writing are as early as AD 49, within 20 years of the events. Bible scholar Gary Habermas points out that there's nothing in the ancient world that has this level of documentation. We trust the stories of ancient personalities, such as Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, Cleopatra, etc. And yet, none of these accounts have first-hand witnesses. The sources that we have come from stories written centuries later. Nevertheless, we believe these accounts to be truthful representations of historical events. However, the historical accounts of the ancient world are not even remotely close to having the amount of evidence that first century Christians, writers, have left us. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Paul, a first century Jew living during the time of Christ. He was an elite member of society. He achieved the highest honors one could possibly receive in his society and religion, which was one and the same. He was wealthy, educated, deeply connected, and fanatical about his faith. However, he experienced a conversion that changed all that. He gave it all up for a life of rejection and persecution by his peers. It was all based on his testimony that the resurrected Christ appeared to him in spectacular fashion and changed his life. All the Christians of that era were closely associated with the Apostle Paul, and they also testify to the same event. These witnesses lived and died for their faith. Is it logical that it was all for a lie? You ask yourself that question. The same people who gave us a high standard of morality who called upon those who are of the faith to live a life of sanctity, honesty, and purity, gave us the testimony of the resurrection. It does not make sense that it was all based on a conspiracy to lie, to devise a lie that deceived an entire generation. Does it make sense for any group to devise a fable of this magnitude and never defect from it? They held on to what they believed even to the point of death. They were martyred for their faith. The entire Christian faith stands or falls on the resurrection of Jesus Christ. The manuscript evidence for the reliability of the New Testament is overwhelming. We have hundreds of thousands of manuscripts. Some date as early as the 2nd century. They all come from different regions of the world, and some even from different languages, the variation of which is very minimal. Not enough to change historical narratives nor major doctrines of the faith. Also, early church fathers from the 2nd century quote from the entire body of the New Testament repeatedly in their writings. This is evidence that the early message of Christianity has a sequential chain leading up to the manuscripts we now have. We have direct sources. The documentation can be trusted. We have first-hand witnesses that gave us detailed accounts of the events that took place around the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. You can verify this on your own. Simply Google Daniel B. Wallace, the leading scholar on manuscript evidence in the world. You can also Google Gary Habermas, the leading scholar on the resurrection of Jesus Christ. You can watch them on YouTube. The evidence is there if you are interested in the truth. Lastly, Christ is risen, and he promises to resurrect those who believe in him. In his letter to the Corinthians, Paul said, "But in fact, Christ has been raised from the dead, the first fruits of those that have fallen asleep. For as by a man came death, by a man has come also the resurrection of the dead." The first fruits is a reference to an Old Testament feast. The Israelites presented a sheaf of the first grains that were gathered. The first sheaf of the harvest was consecrated to God. It was symbolic of the good harvest to come. And then all the harvest was regarded as consecrated to him. Jesus Christ resurrected from the dead. Believe in the gospel and you too will be resurrected. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to give us a like and to subscribe to our channel. Until next time, may the love and the peace of God comfort you in all ways. Amen.